I don't think it's an accident that democracy, the combination of democracy and capitalism and political freedom, has been this engine of wealth and creativity, and we should want to defend that because the alternatives, all the alternatives that we know about suck, right? I mean, just where you have an ideology that captures everything with top-down control of individual behavior, and you try to make an economy run on those rails, or you try to make a political system conform, and you have all of these awful experiments that we've seen. Communism being salient, but obviously fascism. All these variants that we are right not to want, and what we have coming over the transom and up through the floor is a political movement and a religious tidal wave, really, of religious conviction coming into Western society, which is using our values against us, right? Our values of tolerance, our values of openness, our values of wanting to help, and our values of self-criticism, where we have looked back on our history of colonialism and racism and all of our tendencies to xenophobia and selfishness, and we have grown sufficiently embarrassed by that, rightly so, and critical of that, rightly so, and not disposed to ever make those mistakes again, rightly so, and now we have genuine bad actors who know that whenever they merely use the term racism, that settles all arguments, at least left of center in our politics, right? You just call someone a racist and you've won. You've revealed them to be a racist, and you've won the argument. And we have Islamist stealth groups in every Western society, I mean, certainly in America and the UK, really trying to advance a theocratic agenda. We have Qatar, which is literally the largest funder of universities in Britain and America now, more than any other country on earth. Qatar, which is governed by a theology that comes straight out of the Muslim Brotherhood. All of this is insidious. All of this is in part what explains the frank delusion of our ostensibly most educated kids in the country, when in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, literally before Israel had done anything in response. This has nothing to do with dead babies in Gaza. This has to do with a knee-jerk reaction against Israel being the bad guys, even when you had over 1,000 people, innocent for the most part, peace activists, murdered in their bedrooms at dawn by a genocidal death cult. Our smartest kids, who are spending $90,000 a year on tuition, couldn't figure out who the bad guys were on October 7th. We are the victim of a kind of psyop, and it's our own values that are being weaponized against us.
How is the psyop running, Konstantin? What is it that it peristetizes in our mind? Is it just distance from the winning of all these freedoms? Is it something else?
Well, let me come back and just first talk a little bit about the West and what I think makes it great. I think Sam did a great job of outlining a lot of that. I would just maybe build a little bit on some of the things you said. And one of them is, it is my experience that people in the West fundamentally do not understand, even remotely, how unique what we have in the West is, particularly when it comes to individual rights. I mean, we live in a world in which if you accumulate wealth, as you have, you're essentially, that's your wealth. You're protected. This is not the case in most of the rest of the world today. There is no private property at a high level in Russia. Mikhail Khodorkovsky was the richest man in Russia. And the moment he tried to say anything about, he just tried to give some money to an opposition party that was against Vladimir Putin. He ceased being the richest man in Russia almost immediately and went to prison for 10 years, to a penal colony, eventually exiled. The same is true in China. Yeah. Jack Ma, billionaire, criticizes banking regulations, not banking regulations, disappears for a year, not heard of, not heard from for.
It came back no longer criticizing.
Came back with a very
regulations.
different opinion, just magically. And there are other people like that, but Bao Mao, so I can't remember the other guy's name. These are just examples of something that is routine. So the idea, and this is why our system works. This isn't like, oh, it's nice that billionaires can keep that. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, our system works because the incentive structure works. The incentive structure in Russia or in China is not to create things of value to other people and therefore become rich, as you have done. It is to serve the system, to serve the people above you, to serve the people above you in the hierarchy, in their corrupt needs. If you do that, you will become rich in Russia, or you will retain your wealth in Russia. And if you fail to do that, you will cease to be rich in Russia. So the reason our system works is because we have created incentive structures that take us forward, that mean that talented, inventive, creative, driven, passionate, smart people can profit from that talent, can profit from their own hard work and retain what they create. The same is true on almost every level. I mean, our technological progress, this is a self-evident thing that smart people don't talk about, but I feel like sometimes it needs explaining. The reason the West is so technologically superior is not disconnected from its culture of freedom of the individual. I mean, this should be obvious to people, but for some reason we don't talk about it nearly enough. The reason we are the most technically advanced society in the world and in the history of the world is partly because we allow people to pursue their curious interest and to profit from them if they create something of value to other people. So I think sometimes when we talk about this idea of individual freedom, we talk about them in a kind of moral sense, like, oh, it's good. It's obviously good. It's obviously good for people to be free. Well, actually, yes. And also there are some very practical consequences of that freedom that are the reason we are where we are. So that's just a little bit of why I think the West is unique and it's worth protecting. And, you know, we've used the word experiment a lot, talking about communism and others. We should be honest. Liberal democracy is an experiment, and a very recent one, So, like all new ideas, it can go off the rails very easily if the core of what made it what it is not maintained. And I think the reason that many of us have been speaking up about this for some time now, and the reason I wrote my book and many other people have been talking about this, is I think we're abandoning the things that made us who we are, and we're abandoning some of the things which we ultimately, after centuries of struggle and bloodshed and violence and disagreement, we actually were starting to reach a place where we were identifying some of the memes, as you like to call them, that work in the type of society that we want to create. The idea that people should be treated on the content of their character was a meme that was developed through a lot of pain and a lot of suffering and a lot of violence and a lot of discrimination and a lot of awful treatment of, in that particular case, black people. But if you go to other parts of the West, there would have been other ways of conceptualizing that still exist, right? And we eventually came to the idea that actually that ancient thing that is so hardwired into us, the tribalism, the call it racism, call it xenophobia, whatever, it's just in-group, out-group, right? That thing that is hardwired into us. We have an intellectual idea that can sit on top of that can mitigate a lot of that. That's incredible. It's an incredible, I mean, this idea doesn't exist in China. The idea that people are to be treated equally, irrespective of their race or ethnicity or religion. And I wrote a whole piece on my Substack a while ago about talking about this. And I just gave example after example of, in China, we talk about racism all the time in the UK, for example, right? And I just gave an example of a commercial in China where a Chinese girl is doing the laundry and a black guy comes up to her and he starts flirting with her. And she's like, ugh. She shoves him into the washing machine, puts this product that's being advertised in, and guess what the payoff is? He comes out Chinese.
Whoa.
Right? Yeah. This is not a long time ago, and it explains to you why they have 1 million Chinese Uyghurs in concentration camps, right? The idea that all ethnic groups are to be treated equally does not exist in Russia, not even remotely. And Russia is, to a large extent, a multi-ethnic country. It has large Muslim populations, it has large ethnic minority populations. The idea that they are the same as everybody else would seem absurd. to anybody. In most parts of the world, the idea that gay people should be treated the same as straight people, you would be laughed out of the room. People don't like hearing this in the West because they can't process that reality. But it's like, this endlessly joked about queers for Palestine thing. They will throw you off a fucking roof. That's what they're going to do to you.
Yeah.
Right? And from that extreme, you can work your way down. Most of the rest of the world, they're not going to throw you off a roof, but you're not going to be treated equally. So we struggled and we fought and we went through a lot of horror to get to that place. And the symptom of that unraveling that I'm deeply troubled by is that we are doing the exact opposite. DEI is the exact opposite of that idea. And it's embedded in every institution now. The idea that you can pick people, you can say this group has got better outcomes than that group. That means, and we need to treat these people better than these other people, right? It doesn't matter which way you play that dynamic. It's irrelevant. It doesn't matter if it's you put black people at the top, white people at the bottom, brown people at the top, black people. It doesn't matter how you play that game. It always leads to bad outcomes. And the reason that anti-Semitism now is becoming much more prominent is a natural reflection of that worldview. It's a reflection of the worldview in which successful people are successful by virtue of privilege or corruption or abuse of others, and unsuccessful groups or groups that don't do as well in certain fields are there because they have been abused, because they've been taken advantage of. Once you implement that, every successful minority is going to be in the firing line, whether that's Jews, whether that's Asian Americans, whether that's African Americans who are first generation from Africa, right? They are incredibly successful in America. You're going to see all these groups being attacked in some way, whether that's in words or other ways, because we are breaking the thing that made us who we are.
Okay, so assuming that gets embedded in the mind on the back of compassion, essentially.
Yep.
Like, look at these people, you can't leave them behind. Something I've talked about on my podcast before, because my mom was in transportation in a high school. Back where I grew up, there was this law passed called McKinney-Vento, where no child left behind. And they would drive a single school bus 2 hours one way to pick up one kid and bring him back. And I was like, that is compassion turned pathological. Like, that's nonsensical. How do we flip that idea? Because you're definitely not going to get people to buy into something that makes them feel discompassionate.
I think that, look, we come back right to where we started. I think we have to be able to. We have to live in the real world. If we do not live in the real world, we will not survive. And when I say survive, I don't mean that we're all going to die tomorrow. What I mean is there's a difference between Rome and Italy. Ancient Rome, the great civilization, and Italy, which lives on the ruins. I don't mean this to insult my Italian friends. There's a difference between being a great civilization and selling trinkets on the ruins of that great civilization 2,000 years later. It's a big fucking difference. And every American is going to feel that, and every person in the West is going to feel that if we allow our culture to deteriorate to that point. So unless we orientate towards truth, which is the balance between empathy and compassion and pragmatism, that's where that place is, we will not survive. And that's why I keep telling people these depressing things, because unless we get a grasp of where we're heading, I don't think we're going to correct the course. I really don't.
Well, it's also a matter of just consistency. I mean, I think the most effective way of arguing against these extreme positions is to show their internal inconsistencies and the reductio ad absurdum. So, I mean, so on the left, you take the woke left, they're highly sensitized toward around variables like racism and homophobia and political inequality between men and women, say, right? So you take a feminist activist who is all in for Palestine, not especially disposed to think about who Hamas really is, right? And yet can effortlessly see that she's against a white supremacist, theocratic Nazi cult, right? If these were white Christian nationalist, theocrat Nazis who thought women should stay in the house as breeders and just baking and having kids, and that and they express nothing but xenophobia and anti-Semitism and white supremacy. That's all instantly recognizable as evil, and yet you can connect all of those dots for Hamas or any other jihadist or even Islamist organization, and that's exactly who they are. It's exactly who the Muslim Brotherhood is, right? It's exactly some of these groups that are actually funding Middle East studies departments at Georgetown and Princeton. That's who these guys are, right? So the left should be able to see the internal inconsistency. They should be able to see that if they're for women's rights, they're against 98% of girls in Somalia getting clitorectomies, right?
Whoa.
Or women in Iran deciding to take off the veil and being thrown into prison and tortured and raped and even killed for having dared to show their hair, right? And the most obscene distortions of moral intuition here can be seen in moments like when Linda Sarsour, this hijabi theocrat bully, gets picked as one of the women to anchor the Women's March, right? She's wearing, Shepard Fairey does a hijabi poster, and the very symbol of essentially gender apartheid throughout the Muslim world is co-opted as a symbol of women's empowerment in the West, right? This is, it's just a complete nullification of moral intelligence and the very real solidarity that should be obvious between women who care about their rights in the West and the women they ostensibly care about in the Muslim world who are being thrown in prison for taking the hijab off. It's just the confusion is so obvious. It's so right on the surface. Eventually, people will be embarrassed by this. Insofar as culture is incapable of improving itself, and we know it is, there's going to come a time when with all these girls from Barnard and Columbia and Brandeis and all these liberal institutions are going to be embarrassed to look back at how they just got confused about the valence of religious symbols, who their friends were, who their enemies were at moment. It is as upside down as anything awful in our racist past, and it has the additional variable of being masochistic. It's like, at least with old school racist outgroup hatred, it was your attack. The victims are others, but what's happened in the West, to take another example from the UK, like the Rotherham scandal, right, where you have literally over 1,000 English girls, some of whom are 12 years old, getting raped by mostly Pakistani men, and no one is doing anything about it because everyone's afraid to be called racist. So literally, the parents would come into the police station and say, "My daughter was just gang raped by a bunch of taxi drivers," and it wouldn't be prosecuted because the police department was so afraid of being called racist. The optics of the problem was so intolerable that everyone was allergic to it. It's this kind of masochism that is going to undo the West, and it's going to undo I've been saying this for 20 years, and I think hopefully this will never come true, but we're seeing the signs of it coming true. Insofar as the left can't get its head screwed on straight around this specific variable of Islamism and jihadism, it will potentiate the right-wing populism and a thirst for right-wing authoritarianism across the West, and we will have fascist governments because, as David Frum once said, if liberals won't police borders, fascists will, and that's where we're headed unless we talk some sense to ourselves on that topic.
What were you going to say?
Well, I was just going to say, I completely agree with that because, look, ultimately, I have a piece coming out shortly about this. I spent a few weeks with Jordan on tour, and I honestly understood why he talked about order and chaos so much. And ultimately, a few things I've seen and experienced have made me, if you ratchet up the chaos enough, People will crave order so much they're not going to
Yeah.
give a shit who's giving it to them. And this is why I think the only way culturally to solve this problem is you have to make the core Western ideals cool again. They have to be cool. It has to be uncool to be one of these woke people with blue hair. It has to be uncool to have the idea that different groups should be treated differently. It has to be, it's like, why are you being like that? Do you know what I mean? That's what we have to do. Otherwise, it's going to be the option that Sam described. I mean, what is happening? I get very irritated when people say things like, "Well, we're giving all this money to Ukraine, but we can't even police our own border. Why does?" Just like the homelessness in LA that you drive past here every day, just like all sorts of other social problems, this isn't a money problem. It's an ideology problem, right? And until we get that ideology out of power and replace it with one that is more sensible, we are going to ratchet up the chaos more and more, and then the forces of order are going to come back. And that's the story as old as time. We are constantly in the tension, and as I think you articulated last time I was here, when we interviewed you, that balance is necessary between all things. There is a balance to be struck between chaos and order. This is why conservatives often think I'm a conservative, and they get really disappointed when they find I'm not. And people on the left accuse me of being a conservative, even though I'm not. And it's not because I love order and I hate chaos. I'm actually very open to a bit of chaos. I used to be a stand-up. I like making offensive jokes. I'm pro-legalizing some drugs. On all sorts of issues, I like opening up the cultural space. But if you have a lack of order and an abundance of chaos, that's where we're heading, and that's why I'm going. There's too much chaos going on. We've got to be careful, not only because there's a balance that we need, but also if you mess with this, you do not know the forces that you're going to unleash. You do not know the forces you're going to unleash, because what's happening with borders in the UK, that's crazy. What's happening in this country with the southern border, that's crazy. You can't have that and expect people to just sit on their hands. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen.
And the truth is, it's not actually in tension with real compassion, right? Like, you can have the most compassionate immigration policy you want. You still want to implement it in an orderly way. You still want to know who's coming in. You want to be able to let in all the people you actually want in. And if that's 10 million refugees, well, then let it be 10 million refugees. But at least know who's coming into the country, right? So you can. I've never heard a defense of this specific form of chaos. To take immigration as one example, it's like there's no reason for us to have this status quo, and
there's no reason we ought to, or there's no reason to explain why it is.
Well, I mean, logistically, it could just be too hard. I don't know that anyone has actually made the case that actually one person on my podcast made the case that it's actually physically impossible to have a non-porous border. I'm not sure I believe that.
Come on.
But his argument was, when the irony is, or the paradox is, as you specifically with our southern border, as you create the infrastructure. You build the wall, you build roads to the wall so that you can build the wall. You're actually making it easier and easier to get right to the border so that you can actually go under the wall or over the wall.
Yeah, I mean, this feels like an incentive thing. So you have to change the incentive. So I don't know what all the things Biden signed into law when he came into office, but supposedly there was some 50-some things that he did that made it more appealing to be somebody coming across the border.
But putting families in cages and separating kids from their families and such that we can't even reunite them even after a year was not a solution either. I mean, whatever remedy, however we close the border, it can't look like this just dystopian horror show where you've got people, genuinely desperate people who are just trying to seek a better life in cages and separated from their kids, right? So we have to figure.
I know nothing about that part of this story. I don't know why it has to escalate to people in cages, but show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome, right? So there's obviously some incentive has changed. And then also I don't think people understand that if you create an incentive, people are going to take advantage of it. And so
but one incentive that got changed was, listen, it's no longer true that if you get to the border, you might never see your kids again and will wind up in a cage, right? Like that was actually the news of that horror was propagating back into the system and slowing.
None of this has to be like that, though.
Yeah, well,
right?
I
You
would
could
agree.
have a physical border, and then anyone who gets to that border just gets redirected to a legal port of entry where they have to make an application for asylum, just like everybody else, right? It's an ideology problem. If there was the willing, and look, and the reason we know this is there are examples where it's been fixed in recent years. In 2013, Australia had illegal immigration running at 17,000 people, which for their population of about 25 million people is a lot of people.
But they have these islands. I mean, they have geographical advantages that
what they had was a leader who was willing to do some unpleasant things in order to get that problem fixed. And in the short term and in the interim, there were people who suffered as a result of that. In the long term, there are far fewer people who end up making the perilous journey across the ocean, dying, etc. This is the runaway compassion thing. Look, the idea that a country can have a border is uncontroversial. It's been the case throughout history. How many marine bases are getting invaded in this country? None, because they have a border that's enforced, that's protected.
Right. But I mean, there's a larger geopolitical issue here, which I think our compassion should spread to, which is we should recognize that we have an interest in not merely exporting chaos beyond our borders.
Sure.
We want a world order that is more and more sustainable, more and more equitable. And so we have an interest, if even just a purely selfish interest, to make life better in a place like Honduras, so that we don't have so many Hondurans escaping the murder capital of the world or seeking to escape it to come to America, right? So that's
100%.
If you like that clip, check out the full powerful episode here, and I'll see you there.